for the next Zelda game, where would you like to see it be on the timeline? I would like them to make one that takes place after Majora's Mask. This is my question for the Q&A. This is from Nova Boom. So, since I don't think you've played all of the Zelda games, are you familiar with the Zelda timeline?
I haven't played them all. I've dropped in and out. I wouldn't consider myself like, you know, fully au fait, if you see what I mean. Yeah. So
I think a better way to, if we change your question a little bit, what Zelda game have you played that you think mostly deserves a sequel? Because he says they should make one after Majora's Mask. So if we take that part of the question, what Zelda game would you like to see a direct sequel to? We have, like Majora's Mask is a direct sequel to Ocarina of Time. Zelda 2, obviously direct sequel to Zelda 1. We have a couple of other direct sequels, like Phantom Hourglass for the DS is a direct sequel to Wind Waker on the GameCube. But which Zelda game would you like to see a direct sequel to?
I'm kind of with Nova Boom on this. I really like that idea.
So a third Hero of Time game.
Yeah, I think it could be really interesting. I mean, I do feel like those two had quite a lot to say, quite a lot of areas to explore.
Yeah.
And of course, because of the sort of time element to it, there's no real limitation on where you could take it. And it's, when did Majora's Mask come out now? It's so long ago.
2000.
I would be really fascinated to see now how that could be reimagined. At least for me, I think that'd be cool.
I would like to see, it would be very interesting. We have another question that kind of ties into my answer, but I would like to see a sequel to Twilight Princess, because in a lot of ways it was essentially like a modernized, for the time, a modernized version of Ocarina of Time. It retold a lot of the same stories. In Ocarina of Time, you start in the forest area, then you go to the fire area, to the water area. Something happens to sort of change the game. In Ocarina of Time, you get to become an adult after the first 3 areas. In Twilight Princess, you start off in the forest area where you've been living. You travel to the fire area, then the third is the water area. So there's a lot of the same patterns there. So I always thought it would be interesting to see Twilight Princess takes place like 100 or a few hundred years after Ocarina of Time. But after Ocarina of Time, Link travels to Termina for Majora's Mask. If they did something similar for Twilight Princess, to where that same Link, a few hundred years after Majora's Mask, travels to Termina, what would Termina look like in that past 100 years? You get to see all of the differences and how Hyrule has progressed between those hundreds of years, but how would Termina have progressed in those hundreds of years, since there's no longer like a giant moon about to crush everything. So like,
minor details, right?
Yeah, and of course Hyrule from Twilight Princess is like 10 times larger than Hyrule from Ocarina of Time. So what would Termina look like on the scale of Hyrule from Twilight Princess? So
I would love to see a massive sort of brainstorm session from, you know, everybody at Nintendo throwing ideas out about this, because that'd be so much fun.
Yeah, that would be mine. So you would like to see a direct sequel to Majora's Mask?
But I love what you're saying also. That's extraordinarily compelling.
Yeah.
So.
And in yours, would you have it stay in Termina, or would you go back to Hyrule, or a different area altogether?
No, I think it needs to stay on one of those two. Otherwise, you're kind of doing a reimagining that is no longer a sequel, if that makes sense. But I don't know which one I'd like to see it in, to be honest. I guess it totally depends how it's presented, and what the bigwigs at Nintendo come out with to illustrate that.
All right, and we can go on to the final question here. We have a couple, but they have to do with like a lot of the in-game stuff. Well, here's a quick one. I guess we can do both of them. Mini Ben 2003 says, could you do a video on predictions for future dungeons? So I'm going to change this up a bit. Instead of doing a video predicting future dungeons, I want to ask, what is your favorite dungeon from the Zelda series? So Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, any game, what would be your favorite?
I mean, I everybody's gonna hate me for this, I'm quite sure, but I just love the old Ocarina of Time game. I just really enjoy it. But then I'm very childish, so but I loved that game, and I have very fond memories of going through. I enjoyed the water temple because that kicked my ass so many times. So it was, you know, if I had to take a punt right now, I'd go for that one.
Let's say my favorite is, did you play the Stone Tower Temple and Majora's Mask, the 4th dungeon?
Yeah, eons ago now, but yeah,
okay, yeah, it has a weird mechanic that I don't think has been explored in any other dungeon, where like halfway through the dungeon you have to run outside the dungeon, and then there's like the picture of a sun, and you have to shoot it with a light arrow, and the whole dungeon turns upside down.
Yeah.
So previously you would go into a room and you would see a treasure chest on the top of the ceiling, or you would see a door on the side of the wall, and you're thinking, that doesn't make sense, I can't get up there. But then the dungeon turns upside down and it all makes sense suddenly. And then not only is there that mechanic, but with the previous dungeons, the first dungeon is based all around the forest area. The second dungeon is based entirely around fire theme. And the third dungeon is the typical water dungeon. This dungeon takes all three of those and kind of mixes them in to where suddenly you have to like remember back to everything you've learned from the previous dungeons while it adds in its own unique mechanics. So that's my favorite. But as for, like, you mentioned the water temple, like, because it was so difficult to a lot of people, means that they had to be very creative and designing the layout and everything. Plus it has like one of the most iconic, and I think the only fight in a 3D Zelda game with Dark Link. So that was very interesting as well. All right, let's see here. I think we are at our final question, which again, this is one of the questions that has to do with, like, you'd really have to play the game to kind of get it. But Sky Waybright says, why did they cut the hook shot? It's one of Link's most iconic items in the series, and whether it's the regular hook shot or the double claw shot that I loved in Twilight Princess, they should have kept it. Maybe you could obtain it in a dungeon to get around the place easier. Regardless, if Nintendo brings it back in a sequel or a third DLC, I want it, and so do a lot of other people, particularly the double claw shot that allowed you to become Spider Link in Twilight Princess. The items was oh so satisfying, but why did they cut it? So this, on our last podcast, there was a news story where they talked about some of the items that they cut from the game. And they basically said they cut the hook shot, which, were you a fan of the hook shot from Ocarina of Time?
I really enjoyed it. It's weird to me to imagine a game without it. And I'm guessing that's exactly the experience a lot of other people had, because it was so integral, you know, to the user experience, certainly, and some of the levels that were pretty much built on it. Yeah,
you could pull stuff to you, but bring yourself closer to items, get to areas that you couldn't reach otherwise. But in Breath of the Wild, one of the biggest game mechanics, one of the new game mechanics, was that you could literally anything that you seen you could climb on. So like in Ocarina of Time, if you remember back to Kakariko Village, you could hook shot onto some of the roofs, and you could like go across from the top of one house to the top of another. In this game, Breath of the Wild, you can just climb on the side of the house to the top of the building. You can climb on top of trees. You can climb, make your way up like giant mountains. So there's really no need for the hook shot. And they said that with the hook shot, it would have broken a lot of the gameplay, because a lot of the difficulty and problem solving that comes with climbing, like maybe there's a giant mountain with something at the top that you need to get to, but halfway up there is a row of thorns or something, or maybe in the game if it starts raining, then certain things will become too wet and you'll start to slide down because you can't grip onto it. So climbing wasn't just a way to get from one place to another. They used it as one of the game mechanics for problem solving. And if you had the hook shot, you could just hook shot yourself like directly to the very top without having to do any of the puzzles. So they felt it just kind of broke the game. Yeah. Which kind of makes sense, but
no, I do understand it. I mean, part of it, you know, my memories of using it were so much about it presented a different speed, if you remember that, in the game. And, you know, we were talking about Spider-Man earlier in that sort of Disney link in, weren't we? And there's a real sort of fun element of that change of pace and that sort of immediacy. And I could see in a lot of video games, as I say, I haven't played this one at the moment, but climbing can be a slower, more laborious process. And while it could be really interesting in some terms of problem solving, I wonder whether a lot of people also remember that as that fun sort of dynamic movement that maybe doesn't work the same way without it. I don't know. You will know better than I.
And did you play Twilight Princess?
Yeah, a very long time ago. It's been...
In Twilight Princess, they also did it in Skyward Sword, but it was very unique to where they changed the hook shot to the claw shot, and then you could get two of them.
Yeah.
So as on Ocarina of Time, you could just pull yourself towards something, and then you'd have to stay there. But in Twilight Princess, you could, you know, as like he said, a spider link, you could just, you know, keep pulling yourself and really use it to advance yourself almost anywhere you needed to go, and it was really cool.
It's just a fun, different dynamic to running around or climbing, and I could see why people would miss it.
Yeah. Well, they did a lot of, like, the entire idea behind Breath of the Wild was to change what people thought of a Zelda game, so they implemented a lot of new ideas. The problem was the game turned out amazing. A lot of websites, magazines gave it like a 10 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10. It won a lot of awards, but the die-hard Zelda fans think that it implemented too many new ideas. So hopefully with the next Zelda game, it's a happy mix of all of the good stuff that they implemented in Breath of the Wild with a lot of the older familiar mechanics that people like. For example, bombs in this game. Instead of collecting physical bombs that have a number, you get the Sheikah Slate, which is your main item in this game, has magical powers. You can get different runes for different powers. One of the runes lets you kind of gives you the power of Magneto from the X-Men, where you can lift up metal objects, pull them closer to you, stuff like that. One of them allows you to create round bombs. One lets you create square bombs. So you have infinite bombs, but once you use them, they kind of you have like 30 seconds or 10 seconds before you can create another bomb. So a lot of people were hoping that you would get something similar to a hookshot rune. A lot of people were thinking maybe you get the actual hookshot. It was one of the big hopes for when a lot of people were talking about what are they going to give you in the DLC. A lot of people was hoping for this. This is my final question for you, because I thought it was kind of outrageous. Like, it's fun, it's cool, but it doesn't make any sense to me. So in the new DLC for beating the new dungeon, you get a motorcycle. Have you seen this?
I have seen this, actually.
What are your thoughts on this?
I mean, it's no Epona the horse, is it, if we're honest?
Yeah.
It kind of, for me, don't get me wrong, like, as we talked about with the movie, you do need to make strong creative choices to keep a franchise feeling fresh and feeling alive. But when Link's got his fancy new Harley, you I don't know, you kind of get, for me, it loses some of that medieval style mystique that the game is kind of built on, and that's the world you live in. You kind of accept that, kind of like you said with, you know, if you came back to Hyrule or whatever 100 years later or a couple of 100 years later, you still wouldn't expect them to walk around with cell phones. You know, it doesn't, there's like lines and lines, and changing some of those things. It's meant to be this magical medieval-esque kingdom, not really 20th 21st century technology, and it's I don't know, for me, things like that, they kind of, I want to see those things in the Avengers. I don't know if I want to see them in Zelda, but that's just me.
What I thought, which again, as an idea, I loved it. It's really fun if you're playing the game to get from one spot to another on the motorcycle, but it does take me out of the game. Like, it kind of breaks down the fourth wall a bit.
Yeah.
But my thought is how they came up with it was when they were thinking of the DLC, they were like, okay, what is something cool we can add to the world? And someone was saying hookshot, like we were talking about. Other people were like naming off a bunch of different things. And then someone just abruptly said, oh, a motorcycle. Like, of course it would be like the funnest mechanic that you could add to the game. But it may not be the one that makes the most sense.
Yeah, so, I think that's fair.
Yeah, I think it was people sitting in their room, talking, having their meeting, whatever they're doing, talking about the DLC for the game. And instead of thinking about the most logical thing or what would make sense, they were all just thinking about what would bring the most fun to the game.
Right. Yeah.
So in that way it makes sense. But anyways, this brings us to the very end of the podcast. Hold on. That was my little brother, who came at a perfect time because we are just now ending this. I was doing the outro, and he's like, hey, you have to come downstairs. But yeah, all right. So once again, Orion, thank you for joining on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Once again, for anyone who may be interested in checking out your band or more about yourself, where could they find you or find your band?
So band is super easy. City of Ashes Band on YouTube or Facebook, or City of Ashes on Twitter. And myself, if anybody wants to, you know, get in touch, you're very welcome. You could look up Ori of Ashes on Twitter, and tweet away. And I'm sure, I think you said you'd have these overlaid anyway, so Jesse will probably have it on the screen anyway for you. Yes. But thank you guys so much for having me. Jesse, thank you so much for having me, man.
Thank you for joining. Hopefully we can do this again sometime soon with Daniel. And you have your upcoming EP that's coming out soon. Yeah. People should look forward to it as well.
I hope they do.
When can we expect more information about it?
It'll be sometime in the new year. We'll start to get a little more into letting people know about what's going on with them.
All right. Well, thank you once again, Orion, for joining on the podcast. And thank you everybody for watching. The videos on this channel are funded by supporters on Patreon like you. If you're a fan of this channel and would like to join on videos, receive shoutouts, watch videos early, have your questions answered, or have your topic discussed on our podcast, please consider supporting on Patreon for these and many other rewards for just $1. Shoutouts for this video includes Link Use the Triforce, Rusty Caulfield, Lovable Christie, Give Time 15, Shadow to Us, Robbie Morgan, and Lunarium. I want to thank all of you for everything you have done to help support this channel.